In this video, we're going to talk about the steps that I took to first create this map and the models and textures, and then how I imported them into S&Box. It's a bit of a process, and we're going to look at most of the steps that were needed to complete this. So if we're making a desert, the first thing we need, of course, is the sand. And with the map, everything in it was hand painted. And to make a ground texture, first we're starting with just the basic lines. And these dark lines are going to be dunes. So where the dunes are. And you'll notice that as I paint on some parts of this, it paints also on other parts of the texture image. And that's because this picture is something called tiled. It's a tile texture, which means basically you can repeat it endlessly and it won't have jagged lines or it won't look strange. It's going to look like it's repeating, but it'll flow well together. Here I'm just smoothing some stuff in and drawing some sharper lines. After painting that image, you can see here what the final result looks like. If I zoom in, you can see that these are all tiled. So this is 4 different planes, 4 different blocks that I have, each with the image, and there's not lines separating them. It looks like it flows well. After that, I made a second texture image of the same style, and the reason for that will be apparent later. So now we're opening up the S&Box game editor, which is basically where you import files or where you create maps or create anything for S&Box using Source 2. And to import the materials I just created, we have to create something called an add-on. And add-ons can be maps, they can be game modes, they can be lots of things, they can be single props. But that's where you collect your files. So I'm importing those 2 texture images I just painted and going over to something called Material Editor, which is where I upload it, in a sense, to S&Box. So I'm creating this new material, and when I make it, I'm making it blendable. So blendable means I'm taking 2 materials and using a blend tool in the Hammer editor, I'm going to be able to paint over these materials. So the way it works is it's one material with 2 different versions on it. And those 2 versions will be the 2 different textures I painted. Using the blending tool, I can select which version of the sand is going to appear and make it look kind of smooth. We'll talk about that more soon. But now we're going over to the Hammer editor, which is the map making tool. And I'm creating just a small flat plane to test out the texture and place it on. So when I paste this texture in, you can see what it looks like. Pretty boring right now because there's no lighting. So it's going to look ugly regardless. But it imported well. All the lines are clear. Now I'm subdividing this small map into smaller boxes. And the reason for that is because if I have these small boxes, I can start using the blending texture tool. So here, with a low strength, you can see what it looks like when I paste the other version of the sand over. I'm just going to use that so that the map looks a little less monotonous later on, so it doesn't look like it's all the same texture. Alright, now we're just doing a little bit of terrain editing to give this some variety, and I'm painting in the other version. And loading it up, and here we go. So now, without any lighting, it's pretty ugly like I said, but you can see that the texture is clear. There's no errors visible. You can see both versions of it. So perfect, that's what we wanted. Now, I'm adding in an environment light, which is like a sun, basically. Something cool about this is that you can edit the direction of the sun pretty easily. So right there, you just saw me change the angle of the sun, and that really makes a big difference. But another thing that we can do to improve the way the texture looks is adding in a couple maps. We're going to be adding specifically a normal map and a roughness map. So a normal map works by changing the way light reflects on the texture. If the texture is dark in some places, the light is going to reflect differently, and that gives it a false illusion of having depth. So we can have a square box like this, 4 vertices, 4 points, that looks like it has a lot of depth inside of it. once I have the normal map, which was that blue and purple texture on the bottom left, now we're taking the same image texture, going into GIMP, a photo editor, and making grayscale. This is for the roughness map. When you have a roughness map, it needs to be black and white, and the strength of the white and black colors changes how strong the reflection will be. On the spots where it's dark, it's going to be less reflective. On the spots where it's bright, it's going to be more reflective. Then we go over to S&Box, import both of those textures, the normal map and the roughness map, and plug them into that blended texture that we have. Right away, when we plugged it in, you can see how it changes the way the texture looks in regards to its depth. It looks like it goes deeper in the black spots. Then we put in the roughness map, and that solves the problem of the texture looking very plasticky and unrealistic. We do the same process with the other version of the blended texture, create the normal and the roughness map, and the final result is this. You can see now, it looks like the ground has depth. It looks like these dunes rise and lower. So that basically finishes up what we were doing with the sand. We have our ground now, and that's the biggest step. But now we're going to move on to making some of the models that we'll use in the map itself. I don't remember the name of this site. I just found an image online. I think it was called Palmyra, something like that. That had some desert ruins because a pyramid is just too cliche. And I decided to model one of these pillars because I thought that would be a cool standalone object. Once we have that really basic model, we're going to go ahead and start sculpting it. Now, the purpose of sculpting it is to give it an appearance just like with the normal maps that we talked about before, where it can be low polygon, low poly count, so it performs well, doesn't lag, but it can have the illusion of being high poly count. We're cutting in some lines here using the sculpting tools. These are just going to be different spots where the stones connect, giving it some more depth in these lines. And then we're just going over it real quick with the smooth tool so that it looks a little better. After that, we're using a cloud texture, which comes in Blender as default, to sculpt this rock. Now, the way this works is instead of having it just be a flat paintbrush, it's using instead the appearance of a cloud to give this some more variety. You can see how it looks a bit like rock erosion over time. Now we're just smoothing it in a couple spots so that it's not too severe. And right there, we have our sculpted pillar. Now, just like the ground texture, we're going to paint this using our tablet and paintbrush. We're starting with a very basic brown color and then shading it in with other variants, a little darker, a little lighter. Once it has a good bit of color variety, we're going to create some little lines here just to simulate, I suppose, rock erosion over time. I know it's not accurate to how a rock would decay, but I'm no rock expert. So then we're going over to the lines that we created with sculpting, shading those dark. And that'll give it an appearance of being deep. Shading it in a little more, doing that to all of those lines we sculpted in. And finally, we're just painting the whole bottom of the color darker. I have a mirror on, so when I paint on one side, it paints it on all sides of this. Now we're going over to those same lines and putting some white. Now we're going over to those same lines and painting them white underneath, just as highlights. This gives it a better appearance of depth. Then we're smoothing all that in again, make it less jagged. Also painting the top of this pillar white to simulate how the sun would hit that the most, and painting all of it on the top a little lighter. Once we finally port this into S&Box, this is our end result. I'm pretty happy with this. But we also need some rocks to go around on this map. So we're going to take these very basic models I made. Start sculpting them in. Here I'm just making the lines much smoother, giving them some variety. And once I have that done, I just smooth over the entire model itself to get rid of those jagged parts and to make it look a little more natural. Putting in some erosion lines here. And finalizing it up. That's what we got. It's a very basic little rock, but it'll do the job here. Then we do the same thing to those other models. I'm not going to show you that because I don't want to make you too bored. And once we have them all sculpted, we're just going to paint them a bit. Same idea as the pillar. We're going to paint them, give it some color variation, make some of the spots darker, some of the spots lighter. Then I'm also using the cloud texture, same one as before, to give it the illusion of being like a rock with spotty coloration. There we go. We got all 4 of our rocks, stones, I should say, porting them in, and that's our result. I also skipped the part where I made a long pillar, but I just made that by taking one of those rocks, making it a little bit brighter, and then making it longer as well. So now that we have our models, I decided it's time to make the official or the final terrain. And we're doing the same process as before, so subdividing a flat plane. And now we're going to use the same terrain generation tool, but I'm going to do it with a bit more detail, so it looks more like realistic sand dunes. First, we're painting in these basic lines, and I'm also doing a much larger brush to cover the entire map, so that way it's not completely flat. So there's a height variation. With those lines, they're really ugly, so I'm smoothing them over. The purpose of those is to serve as the template for where I'm going to place the dunes. Once I've smoothed over everything pretty good, it's time to start making the dunes themselves. And the way we do that is by taking this pinch brush. So it's like I'm pinching the ground, elevating it a little bit, and this serves as the top of a dune. Smooth those over a little bit because they're pretty sharp in some spots. And that's pretty good. Next, we're going back to that testing map that I made at the very beginning, taking the environment light along with the environment sky, which gives it sort of like a blue coloration, copying and pasting those into the map so we have good looking lighting. Once we have that, it's time to make the 3D skybox. Now, the purpose of the 3D skybox is to take parts of the map that the player won't access and make it more optimized. I don't intend for this map to be large or anything, so we're just cutting out a portion of the center, and that's going to be our playable area. The rest is going to be our 3D skybox. So I'm creating the 3D skybox map, copying over that outside portion, and pasting it in. I was working on my laptop here. I didn't have a keypad with me, so I had to use a virtual keyboard and make this 3D skybox 0.0625 times its original size, because that's the size that we use for skyboxes. Once we have it small, I just have to adjust the texture using the modify texture tools that you see and match it up with the texture of the normal map, and it looks perfectly normal. We're adding in a sky camera here, and that's basically how we're going to reference this skybox and put it into our other map. So now I'm going to move this cutout, save it for later in case there's any errors, and paste in a 3D skybox. And you can see it didn't line up perfectly because I made some mistakes, but with just a little bit of movement, I'm able to line it up pretty accurately. Good enough for me. I don't need it to be perfect because players aren't going to reach that edge anyways. Now if we go to the center, it's almost seamless. There's a few spots where you can see the edge of the map and the beginning of the 3D skybox, but that's fine with me. With the terrain done, we can move on to placing in the props that we created. So I'm starting with putting in those pillars. I'm putting in quite a few of them and then rotating this section of them. They fit the terrain a little better. And I'm also lowering them because that'll give the appearance that the sand has begun to cover it. And I also hid the 3D skybox, so only the playable terrain is visible. Covering this fallen pillar as well, just to give that same impression of sand covering everything. And then placing in a couple of those really long stone blocks. Some on top of the pillar, some on the ground, as well as all of those rocks that we made. Stones, I suppose. I'm making it so that it has the appearance of once being a wall, but I'm also putting some stones all scattered around just to look nice. And with those props placed, I'm blending the texture a little bit with that first blended material we created. That way the sand looks a little disturbed around these stone objects. And I didn't show you this because it's kind of a repeat of the rocks and the pillars, but I made these wooden scaffolding. Nothing too crazy. It's just 2 wooden poles and then 2 wooden planks that I resized and moved around. And that gives the impression that this was once an archaeological zone or an excavation site. With that in, I'd say the props look pretty nice, so we can move on to the final part of this map, which is adding in visibility along with fog and finish the lighting. So the fog, I didn't show you that process, but it's just a simple placing in a fog entity. We used a gradient fog and then an environment fog. And here you can see 2 boxes. So the way these 2 boxes work is the blue one is a restriction on visibility. So outside of the blue, nothing has to be rendered. It makes the processing of this map a lot faster, and it makes the lag less, things like that. And then the smaller yellow box inside is an invisible wall that I put around the corners of the map, the edges of the map. That way players can't get close enough to the 3D. That way players can't get close enough to the 3D skybox to tell that there's anything weird going on. With that all in, you can see the map is looking all right. And then we have to upload it to Asset Party, which is basically the Steam workshop of this game, Sandbox. And once it's finally uploaded, I'm going to open up a Sandbox game mode just to try out our map. And this is the final result. Sand looks real nice. I'm real happy with the sand. The way the light flecks on it looks great to me. And then we have our pillars, our stone blocks, our scaffolding, and dunes off in the distance. You'll notice, by the way, that the skybox includes some things far off in the distance. And it's because I just took one of their default skyboxes and used that. So this is our end result. All of that work culminates in this. I could take these models and materials and use them in other projects in the future. But for now, that's where we'll finish. Thanks for watching.